it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Tales from the Iron Triangle. The Tunnels of Vin Du Lai. Operation Junction City, March 1967. Republic of South Vietnam. Captain Quang Minh, the company's commander and communist political officer, blew his whistle once, and at the shrill signal, Private Tran Gio Nguyen and 75 of his fellow Viet Cong fighters laid down with their backs on the ground of a dry rice paddy and pointed their AK-47s, SKS rifles, and captured M16 rifles straight up into the air. Tran gulped as he saw black smoke in the distance of the grey cloudy sky, and the ground vibrated from the reverberating roar of powerful jet engines. The telltale sign that the big American Air Force F-4 Phantom fighter jet was turning to start an attack run. The mighty fighter jet banked and straightened its wings, diving towards where the Viet Cong 773rd Revolutionary Infantry Company was laying in ambush, and the air screamed as a hurricane force of thunderous engines hurled the American warplane towards the earth. Captain Minh blew his whistle twice as the jet loomed closer, and, at the last long, shrilling blow, the entire VC company fired all their weapons straight up into the air as the F-4 Phantom roared overhead, sending thousands of small arms rounds racing skywards. However, as Tran had expected, the American jet flew right through the fusillade of lead as if it weren't even there. Two dark green dots separated the Phantom's wings, which fell towards a closely grouped community of thatched huts and dwellings, which had been built in a large clearing of the jungle. The napalm impacted in the middle of the village, and the jungle was immediately engulfed in an explosive conflagration of fire and black smoke, which rose hundreds of feet in the air like a funeral pyre over the doomed South Vietnamese farming community. Tran smiled as he got up from the ground, brushing the grass and dirt off his black VC uniform. 4 months ago, Tran was living in Quang Tri City, just south of the border with communist North Vietnam. He and his friends, Tioc An, Nam Tron, and Bien Dang, joined the Viet Cong insurgents when the four could not find jobs in the city. Communist recruiters from North Vietnam had infiltrated their low-income community one night, looking for young revolutionaries to join the cause. The speaker, an alluringly beautiful young lady with eyes the color of sparkling emeralds, was very convincing. She was intelligent, having been college-educated in China and in the Soviet Union, and spoke eloquently about the virtues of the socialist communist revolution, while exposing the evils of capitalism and free world markets run by white imperialists which exploited and enslaved the common people. Until that night, Tran and his friends had never known how racist and unfair the world really was, and how oppressed and downtrodden he was by capitalists and the Americans. That night, Tran felt a hatred that he never knew he was supposed to have for his fellow countrymen in the South, for being the lapdogs of the American capitalists. Under the approving eyes of that pretty young lady, and the armed North Vietnamese gunmen whom she had brought with her, Tran and his friends agreed to join their new heroic comrades in the Communist Revolution, and were treated to a dinner of fish, fried rice, and soup. Tran eyed with suspicion those who'd left the meeting without signing to join the revolution. They and their families would be dealt with severely by the heroic VC insurgency later on, when the time was right. 4 months later, Tran and his friends were fighting against the Americans and their South Vietnamese government lapdogs far to the south of Quang Tri, in an area that had become known as the Iron Triangle. Tran and the rest of his communist comrades slowly stood up, wearily watching the Phantom bank away and head back to its base. The American pilot's mission of murder completed. In truth, Tran had little care in the world for the South Vietnamese farmers, which his VC infantry company refused to let leave. The village was named Lao Cai, and the farmers living in Lao Cai village were traitors to the Vietnamese people, and to the heroic cause of the Communist Revolution. All of the villagers were forced to gather at the center of the village, and the elderly village leader and his family were separated from the rest and dragged into the middle of the square. VC soldiers formed a circular perimeter around the frightened villagers, while Captain Min addressed the village leader directly. The old village leader at first refused to let the heroic Viet Cong People's Liberation Army hide their weapons, equipment, ammunition and food in the village, arguing that if the Americans or South Vietnamese government soldiers found it, the innocent people of Lao Cai village would be labeled as VC sympathizers, and they would be punished. Then Captain Quang Min went into a rage and accused the village leader of being a supporter of the capitalist Americans and the puppet government in Saigon. Min snapped his fingers, glaring at the traitorous village leader, and at that, several Viet Cong soldiers subdued the village leader's 4 daughters, ripping away their clothing and abusing them as the old man was forced to watch. Tran did not partake in the violating of the young women, as he'd had his fun last time his company visited a South Vietnamese farming village. But he did cheer as his comrades had their pleasure with the crying girls, and applauded with the rest of the company as his best friend, Private Tiao Khan, finally lost his virginity. The village leader's eldest daughter, abused nearly to death, finally had her suffering ended when the heroic VC liberators beheaded her. She was not as pretty as the young lady who spoke to them in Quang Tri, so Tran didn't mind as her head rolled onto the dirt. When the VC then threatened to gun down the village leader's grandchildren, the grieving old village leader had no choice but to give in to the communists' demands, finally submitting to the VC's mostly peaceful persuasions. And the VC were mostly peaceful, merciful even, as only one person of the dozens of traitorous Lao Cai villagers was actually killed. And such was the rationality of the heroic VC 773rd Revolutionary Infantry Company, as they courageously fought against the evils of capitalism. Unlike their enemies, everyone who fought for the communist cause was considered mostly peaceful, no matter what they did to further their agenda. However, no sooner had the Viet Cong completed hiding their stores of heavy weapons and ammunition inside the village than the radio came alive, warning the communist heroes that an American air attack was imminent. The villagers panicked and attempted to flee, but the VC ordered them to stay put at gunpoint, the communist political officer promising that the VC would do their duty and protect the village from the American air attack. Minutes later, the villagers and the village disappeared in a rolling ocean of thirsty, unquenchable fire. Tran was disappointed at the loss of his company's supply of rice, weapons, and high-explosive ordnance. Fortunately, the company had a camera crew temporarily attached with them who followed the units, filming the heroic Viet Cong's more patriotic actions to use as propaganda against the hated Americans. The film crew was able to capture the American air attack against the helpless village, bombing them before the heroic VC forces could help the innocent villagers escape. The communists would use the footage of the US air attack as evidence of America's wanton and arbitrary attacks against helpless civilians, using the propaganda to inspire more of his countrymen to join the revolution. Not only that, the communists would release the story to communist reporters worldwide, who would then pass it on to the millions of liberal college-age communist supporters in the United States, fueling their anger against their own country. As General Vo Nguyen Giap, North Vietnam's military leader, once said, "Communist victory in Vietnam will be won in the streets of America." Tran and his comrades congratulated themselves, patting each other on the back for their heroic victory over the capitalists, even as the innocent farming village continued to burn and the weapons, ammunition, and ordnance which they'd hidden in the village had exploded. They cared little for their material losses, as more rice, weapons, and ammunition would be brought down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia and into the Iron Triangle. The heroic 773rd Revolutionary Company would be resupplied again within the next few days. Suddenly, Captain Min's whistle pierced the air, the radio operator pointing in the sky to the south. Tran gulped as he saw black smoke in the sky descending from the grey clouds. The American F-4 Phantom was returning. The company began to run back into the jungle, melting away into a sea of trees and green leaves. However, the fighter was loaded with napalm, and the jungle provided very little protection against flaming, jelly gasoline, which not only burned, but superheated the air in your lungs. But the 773rd didn't need to rely on the dubious protection of the jungle canopy. The soldiers opened several trapdoors camouflaged by dirt and thick branches, pulling them up from the jungle floor to reveal narrow entrances down into a massive tunnel complex. Tran jumped into one of the entrances, hunching down while yelling and pushing his comrades ahead of him, forwards down into the dark, claustrophobic tunnel as more of his comrades jumped in behind him. The narrow tunnel went straight down for about 10 feet, the dirt size barely wide enough to allow the Viet Cong to pass through without scraping their shoulders against the walls. The tunnel then ended at a T-junction, which abruptly turned 90 degrees right and left. Each VC alternately ran down a different direction of the T-junction, right, left, right, left. The comrade in front of Tran took the left turn at the junction, and Tran turned to the right. Still hunched over while he ran, the tunnel Tran found himself in continued for about 30 meters, leading deeper into the ground before abruptly turning left into another, slightly wider tunnel. The echoes of his comrades running and yelling bounced off the walls as they scrambled down the separate tunnels which paralleled the tunnel Tran was in. A few lit torches mounted on the dirt walls provided a dim, flickering light the deeper the VC descended into the complex. Every 10 feet, a shallow alcove was carved into the side of the walls, which could provide emergency cover to a VC soldier. But the VC ignored these and continued to run down the tunnel, which ended at another T-junction. In the middle of the junction, a 4-foot square hole dug onto the floor led down to a lower level of the tunnels. The VC ignored the side tunnels and jumped into the hole, which dropped 6 feet into a wider tunnel. Tran scrambled to the opening and jumped down, holding his AK-47 close to his body. He nearly landed on top of his comrade, who jumped down just before him and who tripped as he tried to get up. Tran grabbed him and pulled him to his feet, pushing him forwards as he ran just as his comrade behind him jumped down the hole. The VC continued running, more of their comrades jumping down holes from the other tunnels above them. The tunnels in this lower level were wider than the ones above, and could allow 2 of the VC to stand side by side. As above, every 10 feet, shallow alcoves were dug into the walls. This time, several of Tran's comrades jumped into the alcoves, crouching down as low as they could. Tran continued running, his back beginning to ache from crouching down and running through these dank, dusty tunnels while following his comrades as they turned down yet another tunnel. Captain Min's whistle reverberated around the tunnels, and the yelling and commotion quieted down as Min yelled, "Take cover! Find cover or get down where you are!" Tran was next to an empty alcove, and he jumped in. His friend Bien was behind him, and had the same idea. Bien jammed himself into the alcove as well, though there was barely enough room for one person. Those VC who could not reach one of the alcoves simply got face down, prone on the ground, their rifles cradled underneath them. Unseen above them, the vengeful American fighter dived towards the jungle. 2 napalm canisters leapt from the wings of the F-4 Phantom, dropping towards the jungle which the VC had disappeared into just minutes earlier. The napalm exploded directly on target over the entrances to the VC tunnels, drowning the jungle foliage on a sea of thirsty fires and black smoke. The wisdom of the VC cutting the tunnels on a 90-degree angle became evident as the deadly effects of the concussive force of exploding gas and heat was stunted and greatly lessened by the walls of the tunnels. The impact of the jet's bombing strike had nearly been nullified by the simple yet effective construction of the tunnel system dug deep into the earth. Nearly nullified, but not totally. The tunnel shook slightly as the napalm impacted. There was a terrible rumbling noise that echoed inside the tunnels, and choking clouds of dust raised in the already stifling air as dirt and sand fell from the ceiling. Tran squeezed his eyes shut, pulling his black uniform shirt over his nose and mouth. The air was sucked out of the tunnel, feeding the angry 5,000-degree firestorm above them. A billowing hot wind blew through the tunnel corridors, and Tran struggled to breathe. The air tasted like gasoline in his mouth, and his comrade Bien, who had crammed himself into the alcove with him, was crying. Tran began coughing, his lungs protesting against the acrid air that he was breathing. He was going to die. They were all going to die of suffocation. Then, after what seemed like an eternity of drowning in superheated air, the rumbling noise of roaring waves above ended, and Tran could breathe again. The tunnels fell into a deathly silence for several moments, as if it had become a tomb, then suddenly erupted with the echoes and cheers and yells from men who had escaped death yet again. It took Captain Min a few minutes to restore order to his jubilant revolutionaries, who had just survived a direct hit by a napalm strike. In the darkness of the tunnels, the few torches which were lit had been extinguished, and it was impossible for them to take an accurate roll call of the unit. Captain Min led the company through the confusing maze of hallways and corridors, leading the VC deeper into the tunnel complex for almost an hour until they arrived at a sturdy wooden ladder leading up through another hole in the ceiling, which led to the upper level of the complex. A dim light shone down from the opening. Captain Min climbed up the ladder first, emerging through the opening into another underground passageway. He was met by a group of 3 other VC who greeted him at the top of the ladder that opened to a relatively wide tunnel. "Comrade Min, sir," said one of the VC, hugging Captain Min. "We saw the American plane returning. I was afraid that you received our warning too late." "Thank you, Chun," said Min. "Your warning was well received. We escaped just in time." One by one, the VC fighters emerged from the lower levels of the tunnel, but it was still too dark and cramped to get an accurate accountability of the units. The VC named Tun led Captain Ming down the tunnel, which rose gradually, as if it had been carved from the side of a hill, as Tran could sense they were climbing higher in elevation. Carved into the dirt to the left and right of them were several small rooms, one which looked to have been set up as a medical aid station. In one small room was a radio set, whose camouflaged antennae poked up through the dirt in the ground and stuck up in the air above them. Oil lamps lit the room, illuminating maps of the Iron Triangle that festooned the walls and showed VC positions, enemy positions, as well as the location of villages nearby. Captain Min entered the room and spoke with Chun, who had turned out to be the leader of the special VC scout and observation team which constantly kept lookout for South Vietnamese government and American troop movements. Meanwhile, Tran and Bien had found their other friend, Private Nan, who had become separated from them down another passageway earlier. "Have you seen Teo?" said Tran. "No," said Nan. "He was behind me at the first junction. I thought Comrade Teo was with you." "Ah," said Bien. "He's around here somewhere. Shit, I can't see my hand in front of my face in these tunnels." "Be silent," said a whispered but stern voice in the darkness. Tran could tell it was the voice of their strict squad leader, Sergeant Hoai Luong. Sergeant Luong was a seasoned combat veteran who'd been recruited 2 years ago from a farming village that had been burned down by government soldiers. "You damn boys never know when to shut up. Captain Min and Comrade Tun are discussing strategy and need silence." "Come, quickly," announced Min as he emerged from the small radio room. "Follow me, comrades, hurry." Tun and 2 of his scouts led the unit down another tunnel, which continued to incline upwards that ended at a trap door. Cautiously pushing up on it, the VC scouts peered around, making sure that the area was clear. Satisfied that they could exit the tunnel in safety, they threw open the trapdoor, allowing the 773rd VC Infantry Company to finally emerge from the dark tunnels and out into the jungle. Tran was blinded momentarily by the sun, which was just now breaking through the grey clouds, and blinked his eyes rapidly in order to get adjusted to the light. As he suspected, they had indeed emerged near the top of a hill, surrounded by thick jungle canopy. The hill was part of a curving ridgeline which looked down into a ravine. In the ravine, a relatively wide dirt trail snaked in between the hill and a dry rice paddy on the opposite side. Captain Tran unfolded his area map and held a quick meeting to confer with his lieutenants. "We're about 800 meters from where we entered the tunnels at here," he said, pointing to his map. "This is Lao Kai village here, 100 meters from the entrance to the tunnels. This road," Min said, pointing to the trail below them, "is right here on the map. We are here." Min pointed to the symbol on the map representing the ridgeline his unit was positioned on. "Comrade Tun just reported to me that he saw several government helicopters landing to the east of us, about 2 kilometers away. No doubt they are government puppet troops going to investigate the handiwork of the American air attack earlier. They will have to pass this way on the road below us. Position your men quickly and order them not to fire until I give the word. Understand?" Min's 4 lieutenants acknowledged their orders, then quickly set about placing their men in optimal positions to fire down at the dirt roads. Lieutenant Cantien, Tran's platoon leader, spoke briefly with Sergeant Luong, and Luong nodded before turning to his squad. Sergeant Luong preferred to keep the 4 city boys together, and he positioned Private Tran next to his platoon's machine gun to provide supporting fires with his AK-47. Private Bien was to the other side of the machine gun, while Private Nan was the loader who would feed the rounds into the machine gun. "Where is the other city boy?" snapped Sergeant Luong. "Where is Private Teo?" "He separated from us earlier," said Tran. "We haven't located him yet." "No matter," said Luong. "We'll find him later. The government troops will be here soon. Private Cao, get your ass over here and man this machine gun." Another of Tran's comrades, a skinny new recruit named Cao, scrambled over to take the machine gun. No sooner had they settled in than the VC company could hear laughing and joking come from around the bend of the dirt road below. Tran watched the South Vietnamese army soldiers, Arvin, wearing US-made military uniforms, well-made US military combat boots, and armed with US-made weapons and equipment, rounded the bend on the dirt road below them. Tran counted at least 100 of the Arvin puppet government soldiers, and the resentment raged within him. His one black uniform set was old and wearing thin, and streaked white from the salt of his sweat. His shoes consisted of nothing more than sandals, called Ho Chi Minh sandals, made from the treads of old rubber tires, and his neckerchief stank of sweat and dirt. Compared to his VC comrades, the government soldiers were well equipped and seemed well fed and well rested. The Arvin soldiers were walking in 2 columns on either side of the road, but seemed to be complacent, talking and joking loudly amongst themselves, as if they were taking a leisurely stroll instead of fighting a war. Perhaps they believed that the American airstrike at Lao Kai village had wiped out the VC, and they were simply going there to collect the bodies. That did not matter to Tran, as he leveled his rifle at a young government soldier carrying a radio. As the head of the Arvin column turned the bend, Captain Min blew his whistle and the shrill sound echoed across the hill, signaling the slaughter to begin. Tran eagerly fired his AK-47, and the soldier he was aiming at threw up his hands and fell to the ground in a cloud of pink smoke. Tran fired again at the dead soldier, destroying the radio on his back. Cao opened fire with a machine gun, stitching the South Vietnamese officer who was next to the radio man. His body jerked around as if he was being stung by hornets before he, too, fell to the ground. The sounds of automatic weapons fire filled the air with a symphony of whistling death as government soldiers caught in the kill zone screamed and died. With the rear end of the column losing sight of the front end of the column because of the bend in the road, the South Vietnamese unit was cut in half and could not bring their numerical superiority to bear on the VC firing down on them from the hillside. An Arvin M60 machine gunner bravely began firing blindly up the hill towards the VC machine gun, which was slaughtering them, only to be cut down himself, his arms flying wide as his chest exploded from AK-47 rounds and spraying his bullets into the soldiers next to him. The South Vietnamese soldiers were all but leaderless and exposed in an open kill zone, getting slaughtered by the dozens. Those who could dropped their weapons and attempted to flee back the way they'd come, or climb up the opposite embankment to try and take cover behind the rice paddy embankments. A few of the braver Arvin sergeants attempted to rally their soldiers and charge up the hill, which the VC were occupying, only to be mercilessly cut down by automatic weapons fire. By now, the VC were firing RPGs at isolated pockets of the government soldiers who'd taken cover in the rice paddy, and screams from dozens of wounded and dying soldiers filled the air. The return fire from the Arvin forces had faded away to nothingness. "Quickly!" yelled Lieutenant Tien. "Captain Min wants us to go down and retrieve everything you can from the puppet soldiers. Move quickly before their helicopters arrive." Tran stood up from where he'd been fighting and prepared to step off down the hill, when he heard his friend Private Bien scream, "Nam!" Tran turned and looked towards where Nam had been loading the machine gun. Private Cow, the gunner, was painfully clutching at his ruined right arm, the muscle and tissue torn away from where the South Vietnamese M60 machine gunner had returned fire before he'd been killed. Beside Private Cow, Private Nam was slumped backwards, the top of his head blown away and a surprised look in his dead eyes. Anger filled Tran's heart. He and Nam had been friends since grade school. "We need a medic here, sir," yelled Bien. "Private Cow is hurt." "I will send him," yelled Lieutenant Tien. "Just get down the hill." "What if they're wounded?" yelled Tran. "There are no wounded," responded the lieutenant. "Now go." Tran ran eagerly down the hill to where the ambush had taken place, ignoring his comrades as they began looting weapons, ammunition, equipment, and packs from the dead government soldiers who littered the ground. He came upon an Arvin soldier sitting on the ground by the side of the road, rocking back and forth, cradling a dead soldier in his arms. Tran ran up behind the government soldier and looked down. The soldier was crying and muttering, "Oh, little brother, I am so sorry. I promised Mother that I would keep you safe. I'm so sorry." Tran stepped around and looked at the dead soldier. He looked like the soldier who was crying over him, only much younger. Tran cocked his AK-47, and as the crying soldier looked up at him, Tran blew his head off. Tran managed to find a wounded Arvin medic behind a shallow mound in the rice paddy that was treating two other soldiers suffering from horrible fragmentation wounds they'd suffered from the blast of a VC RPG. Without saying a word, Tran raised his AK-47 and gunned them all to pieces with automatic weapons fire. He found another government soldier crawling away, both his legs shattered. The terrified soldier rolled over, pleading with Tran for mercy, but his pleas fell on deaf ears as Tran shot him in the groin and left the shaking puppet soldier to painfully bleed to death. As Tran walked back up the road littered with the bodies of his hated enemy, he came across the ruined body of the Arvin radio man he'd killed earlier, and smiled in satisfaction as he saw the bullet-ridden radio on his back. Tran looked down at his own makeshift sandals and removed one of them, placing his dirty foot next to one of the soldier's combat boots. Tran smiled, as the boot was his size, and he set about stripping the dead soldier of his footwear. In minutes, however, Sergeant Luong began yelling at his squad to finish what they were looting and get back up the hill. The VC scout named Tun was on the radio, listening in on the government military frequency, and gave the alert that helicopters were approaching. The VC began scrambling back up the hill, each soldier carrying as many spoils as he could, while Tran followed, happy with just his new pair of jungle boots. Already the distant sound of the air being beaten with the rhythmic whoop-whoop-whoop sound of helicopter blades could be heard as two American UH-1 Huey gunships raced to the site where the South Vietnamese soldiers had been slaughtered. The gunships each fired 2 full pods of air-to-ground rockets at the VC positions, then circled around again to strafe the entire hilltop with machine gun fire and 40mm high-explosive grenades launched from the nose of the helicopters. As soon as the UH-1 gunships pulled away, their ordnance expended. 2 South Vietnamese Air Force A-1D Sky Raiders, huge propeller-driven attack fighters, dived out of the sky, each dropping 2 white phosphorus bombs on the enemy positions, and the hillside vanished in a billowing cloud of burning white phosphorus. By the time the Americans and South Vietnamese were done with their air attack, the entire face of that hill was completely devoid of jungle cover, the entrances to the tunnels completely exposed to the world. Soon either the Americans or South Vietnamese infantry soldiers would discover the tunnels and cave them in with explosives. But it would matter very little to the VC. The 773rd VC Infantry Company had already successfully escaped, and there were thousands more VC tunnel systems all across the Iron Triangle. Captain Min led the 773rd down the tunnel back the way they'd come earlier, from Lao Kai village. The going was slower this time as, aside from Private Cow, he also had 5 other wounded fighters. It was near dark when they finally arrived at the entrance to the tunnel which led to Lao Kai village. Once there, the VC found the answer to the mystery of where their missing fighters had gone. Apparently, not everyone escaped the napalm attack earlier from the American F-4 Phantom. 8 VC bodies lay at the second bend in the upper level of the tunnel, just before the opening which dropped into the lower levels. They were not fast enough to get to the lower level, and were caught in the blast when the napalm erupted. The bodies were not burned, however, the VC fighters having died of asphyxiation when the exploding, jelly gasoline sucked all of the air from their lungs. Tran looked down at the body of his friend, Teo, which had turned white as a sheet. "He died on the day he lost his virginity," said Bien, shaking his head sadly. Captain Min chose to keep the 773rd in the tunnel that night, putting guards on the entrances and approaches in the unlikely event that the Americans or the South Vietnamese decided to come prowling around at night. Thun had the radio tuned into the government channels, and Radio Saigon was alive with the news that over 40 government soldiers were killed and many more were wounded in a deadly VC ambush in the Iron Triangle. But a reprisal attack by the US and South Vietnamese aircraft had killed an estimated 80 VC fighters. Captain Min's men cheered at the high numbers of casualties that they'd inflicted upon the enemy, and laughed at the pathetic attempt by the Saigon government of using propaganda to mask their defeat. The capitalist propagandists were amateurs compared to the propaganda machine of the communists. Captain Min allowed a few torches to be lit inside the tunnels, and despite losing a total of 9 fighters killed that day, the heroic fighters of the 773rd were in a jubilant mood. In the true communist fashion of community sharing, the spoils taken from the enemy were divided and handed out to those who were in need. Those with damaged weapons received a new captured M16 or M79 grenade launcher. Because their food supplies were destroyed earlier, the captured enemy rations were combined into one communal meal, and everyone got an equal portion of the food, with the senior sergeants and officers naturally getting a far larger part of the equal portions. The same was done with the captured enemy equipment and clothing, as those who were in need the most received what they needed from the communal pile. Again, the senior sergeants and the officers, who were in the greatest need because of their higher ranking, had the pick of the litter, quickly grabbing up wet weather gear, towels, soaps, rucksacks, shaving equipment, and extra uniforms. What was left was fairly and equally divided amongst the rest of the soldiers, which, admittedly, wasn't much. Tran was told to hand over his new boots to Lieutenant Tien, whose shoes were showing signs of wear. Tran, trying to hide his reluctance, handed them over to Sergeant Luong, who then walked over to present the prize to the platoon leader. Sergeant Luong told Lieutenant Tien that he was the one that recovered the boots as a gift for his courageous platoon leader. Tran tried to hide his anger at Sergeant Luong when he returned to the portion of the tunnel where his squad was squatting around a small fire. Instead, Tran said, "Comrade Luong, now that you have taken my boots, I have no sandals to wear." Sergeant Luong scooped a spoonful of the rich, captured American field rations from his bowl and into his mouth. Tran's stomach growled. His equal portion of the captured food was less than the senior sergeants, but then again, the leaders required more food than the lower class, since everything must be shared equally. Luong pointed his spoon at Tran. "And where are the sandals that were provided to you, Private Tran?" "I left them on the road after I took the enemy soldiers' boots," said Tran. "So, out of your own greed for capitalist goods, you left your sandals out there on the battlefield. Sandals that were handcrafted by loyal supporters of the revolution. Is that correct, Private Tran?" said Luong, opening up a pound cake from the rations they'd captured. "Yes," said Tran bitterly. No, Comrade Luong." "Ah, you city boys are such prissy little things," laughed the sergeant. He was wearing a pair of olive green pants which he'd recovered from the enemy and wore a captured web belt around his waist with 2 canteens attached, and on his feet was a new pair of green jungle boots which he'd acquired when the captured enemy was fairly and equally handed out. "If you want another pair of sandals," said Sergeant Luong, "I suggest that you ask your friends Private Cow or Private Nam. They won't be needing theirs." Later on, Private Tran was on guard duty near the entrance to the tunnel, looking out into the darkness of the jungle beyond. The tunnel camouflage had been burned away earlier by the napalm strike, so the entrances were left exposed. He had acquired a pair of used Ho Chi Minh sandals from his comrades who would not be needing them anymore. Though his unit had won great propaganda and military victories that day, Tran felt a tinge of bitterness and resentment. Tron had lost 2 close friends today, and he was still thirsty and hungry. His friend, Private Bien, sat next to him in the darkened tunnel to keep him company. Bien reached into his pockets and pulled out 2 sticks of chewing gum, which he took from one of the enemy ration kits. "Here you go, Tron," said Bien. "A little dessert after dinner." "Thank you, Bien," said Tron, taking one of the sticks and popping it into his mouth. "Comrade Sergeant Luong can be an asshole sometimes," said Bien, rolling the chewing gum stick before putting it in his mouth. "But he is a fearless fighter. Are you okay, Tron?" I'm fine," lied Tron, not really knowing why he was so angry. "Okay," said Bien. "It's just that you aren't scheduled to be on guard duty for another 2 hours. You should get some sleep." "I'm not sleepy," said Tron bitterly. "I'll be fine for tomorrow's mission." "Are you angry at Comrade Sergeant Luong?" asked Bien. "Not only did he take your new boots, he took credit for recovering them, and he gave your boots to the lieutenant." "Yes," admitted Tron. "No, I don't know. All of this is the Americans' fault. It's all the capitalists' fault. Teo and Nam would be alive if it weren't for the Americans. This war, our people suffering, it's all their fault." "Yes, I grieve for Teo and Nam. They were my friends too, remember," said Bien. "But we must be patient and not do anything rash or foolish. Victory will come eventually." Tron said nothing as he leaned his head back against the dirt wall of the tunnel as he continued to stare blankly out into the unseen jungle. These past few months, it seemed that Tron only felt 3 emotions: fear and lust, but mostly hate. Any thoughts of such things as compassion and mercy had long since faded from him. All that mattered to him was his anger which fueled his revolutionary drive. And he was eager for the morning to come and the opportunity to kill more of the enemy. In another portion of the tunnels, inside a room lined with heavy wooden planks, Captain Min and his lieutenants hovered around the radio, a map rolled out on a makeshift wooden table. Min held the radio telephone up to his ear, speaking to his regimental commander. "Yes, sir. Yes, I understand. Vin Tu Lai. Yes, sir. Thank you." Captain Min gave the radio telephone back to Toon and smiled at his lieutenants. "Gentlemen, the Colonel is pleased with our work today, and word of our successful ambush has even reached Hanoi. Good work, gentlemen." The assembled lieutenants smiled, patting each other on the back. "Still, we suffered some losses today, as has the regiment as a whole, and we must make good our losses. The Colonel wants the regiment at full strength for a big offensive that is supposed to happen next year during the Tet New Year. For that, we will need more recruits." Min pointed to the map. "There is our next objective, gentlemen. Vin Tu Lai village." Before the sun rose, Tron volunteered to lead a 4-man scouting team to the village of Vin Tu Lai, ahead of the VC main force. Bien also volunteered to go, but Sergeant Luong refused his request, saying that he didn't trust the safety of the unit to 2 loudmouth city boys. Tron led the 4 other VC scouts, 1 soldier from each platoon, out into the jungle, the early morning sky just barely turning a deep purple. The 5 scouts had removed their traditional black VC uniforms and had donned the clothing of local civilian farmers. They stealthily crept through the foliage, stopping often to ensure that they hadn't been detected. Soon they reached the remains of Lao Kai village, small fires still burning on the skeletal remains of the thatched dwellings from the previous day's napalm attack. Tron decided to take a quick look into the demolished village to see if there was anything salvageable that the unit could recover. The acrid smell of burning fuel still lingered in the air, and Tron shuddered at the smell. As they warily crept back to the village square, the first thing that Tron noticed was that the charred bodies of the villagers were missing. There were fresh wagon and hoof tracks in the dirt, indicating that someone had very recently recovered the bodies and made away with them. The tracks led away from the village onto a hard, dirt-packed road. A quick look around the village revealed that all of the rice had been burned and was useless, and the mortars, ordnance, and mines which they'd hidden there the day before had been detonated. There was nothing of value left. Soon the scouting team melted back into the jungle. Vin Tu Lai was 3 kilometers away, and the VC scouts were behind schedule. They stayed inside the tree line and paralleled the hard dirt-packed road which the wagon tracks had gone on. They stopped once they heard a propeller-driven scout aircraft circling somewhere in the dark sky overhead. When the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Tran motioned them to move again, but halted a few minutes later when artillery began falling into a hillside about 1 kilometer from where they'd hunkered down. Once the artillery lifted, Tran said, "Quickly, we must make up for lost time. I have a feeling that the Americans are up to something today." Tran's feelings were confirmed an hour later when they saw 12 American UH-1 Huey utility helicopters descending into a valley a few kilometers east of Vintulai village. It was 8 o'clock in the morning, and the sky had turned a pale blue as the sun rose over the horizon when Tran's scout team reached the perimeter of the target village. Ahead of them, they saw several civilian villagers guiding 3 large wooden carts down the road, being pulled by tired-looking water buffaloes. Piled into each of the wooden carts were dead bodies wrapped in a thin cloth. Suddenly filled with rage, Tran stood up from where he'd been hiding in the tree line and stormed towards the road. His comrades tried to stop him, but they were too late. Tran produced his AK-47 and pointed it at the 9 villagers, yelling, Hey, what are you doing? Where are you going with those bodies?" A middle-aged villager with lean muscles regarded the young man armed with the VC weapon, who suddenly appeared out of the jungle. He stopped the procession of wagons and said, "We are taking these honored dead to bury on hallowed ground at Vintulai." "Where do these bodies come from?" demanded Tran, waving his AK-47 at him. "They are the villagers who were slain in Laukai village," replied the middle-aged villager. "We came from Vintulai village and recovered them last night to give them a proper burial today." Tran sneered at the civilian, who was likely just another puppet of the capitalist Americans. "Uncover the bodies, take off those burial cloths and dump the bodies in the road." The villagers gasped. "Sir," stammered the middle-aged villager, "these good people were mercilessly killed yesterday. They were murdered. Their bodies must be laid to rest in hallowed ground, or their souls will be restless. We cannot abide by what you say." The superstitions of those living in these secluded villages were a constant irritant to Tran. Their adherence to religious myths and old wives' tales only proved to Tran the intellectual superiority of communism, which relied solely on logic and science and propaganda. The communist mind was not enslaved to ancient myths and superstitions. Tran caught the bolt of his AK-47. "I am not interested in your superstitions, old man," he yelled. "Now dump those bodies in the middle of the road. Everyone must see the consequences of supporting the American imperialists." Tran nodded towards the trees, and the 4 other VC scouts emerged, all pointing their weapons at the villagers. "Please," said the middle-aged villager, "you don't know what you're doing. Their spirits are angry. If you—" The villager's chest exploded, and he fell dead to the ground. Tran had no patience for the unenlightened stupidity of these backwoods villagers. A teenage girl screamed and ran to the body of her dead father, wailing uncontrollably. The girl was pretty, and Tran briefly considered taking her into the jungle and having his way with her. But he was running out of time, and the company would be arriving shortly. He walked over and violently grabbed the girl by her hair, waving his AK-47 threateningly at the rest of the villagers. And he yelled, Do you see what happens to those who support the imperialists? Now either dump those bodies in the road or join them." Some of the VC scouts looked on with expressions of shock at Tran's mostly peaceful brutality, but they said nothing as they kept their weapons pointed at the villagers. Left with no alternatives, the grieving villagers began to slowly remove the bodies from the back of the carts, arranging them reverently on the side of the road and saying prayers over them. This only served to further infuriate Tran, and he fired his AK-47 over their heads, warning them that they had 20 seconds to dump all of the bodies on the road. The villagers complied, though they were weeping loudly. Once their grim task was completed, Tran and the other VC scouts climbed aboard the now empty wooden carts and ordered the civilians to begin walking back towards Vintulai village. Behind them, the charred remains of 40 bodies were unceremoniously piled on the road. The courage and sacrifices of the people of Vintulai village will be written in the annals of our glorious communist revolution, yelled Captain Min loudly at the villagers of Vintulai, who were forced to gather in the village square. They sat on the red clay earth surrounded by VC riflemen. Min motioned to a line of 20 young men, all inhabitants of Vintulai, standing nervously beside him. They'd been lined up from eldest to youngest. These young men, aged 13 to 30, will do their patriotic duty to throw off the yoke of imperialist oppression and unify our nation under the progressive banner of the Communist Party. We did not ask for volunteers because it is the duty of all patriotic, military-aged freedom fighters to defeat the Americans. Several older women were sobbing, crying that their sons were being taken away. Captain Min smiled. Yes, 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 brave women of Vintulai. Cry your tears of joy and happiness that soon your sons will be taking up arms to fight against the imperialists. Every tear that you cry is a signal that you wholeheartedly support the glorious revolution. Tran frowned as the wailing and crying of the women grew louder. Their pathetic noise is irritating him. It's right that Captain Min did not give them a choice. Either you supported the glorious communist revolution, or you were an enemy. There was no in-between. Tran admired Captain Min for his patience with these villagers. Instead of making an example of the crying women, Captain Min simply raised his voice. Do not worry, though, continued Min, because before your sons join the heroic forces of the revolution, you will all have the opportunity to do your part to fight the Americans. Over the next few days, you will be assisting my men in digging tunnels under the graveyard of Vintulai. Min's announcement was met with wails of disbelief and despair as the villagers protested bitterly, and Min held up his hands to placate them. Comrades, comrades, comrades. The Americans and their lapdogs in Saigon do not disturb cemeteries or graveyards. We will use their weaknesses against them by hiding our supplies and staging our ambushes from the tunnels we will dig under the graveyard of Vintulai. Despite being surrounded by armed VC, the villagers continued to protest the digging of tunnels under the graveyard. Unfazed, Min pulled his pistol from its holster and fired into the head of the 30-year-old man, the eldest in the lineup of young men. The man's head exploded and he fell in a heap on the dirt. The villagers gasped, and an elderly woman, apparently the man's mother, collapsed. Min walked to the second eldest man, putting the gun to his head. Who is this man's mother? Which of you heartless women are so loyal to the puppet government that you are willing to sacrifice your son's life? Why do you oppose the revolution? Why do you love the Americans over your own people? The villagers were allowed to continue their routine of plowing their fields and planting rice and tea leaves and coffee beans. VC soldiers, disguised as farmers, also worked beside them, but were actually there to keep any of the villagers from running off. Oftentimes, helicopters and jets could be seen overhead, and occasionally American and Arvin patrols could be spied in the distant hills, but Vintulai was left unmolested. The villagers were actually encouraged by Captain Min to increase their work as the fruits of their labor would eventually be turned over to the communists come time for the harvest in late spring and early fall. In the evening, however, the villagers began the task of digging the VC tunnel complex underneath the Vintulai graveyard, though with great reluctance and trepidation. The village women who were not engaged in the digging had been required to cook for the VC and mend and wash their uniforms. They were also forced to service the VC soldiers in other ways. Captain Min didn't keep his entire 773rd VC company at Vintulai. Usually he would station a squad or two there to keep an eye on the villagers during the day, while the rest of the company remained in tunnels which had previously been dug into the jungle about half a kilometre away from the village. Enemy air activity had increased over the past 2 days, so above-ground movement was kept to a minimum. Although Captain Min did have his men dig shallow fighting positions around the tunnel entrances, as well as pits which could hold mortars. At night, the entire company would exit the tunnels and descend on Vintulai, with pickaxe and shovel to continue digging. This cycle continued for 3 days, and in the ensuing time, the regimental commander had sent 2 captured Arvin 81mm mortars to the company, along with crews to man the weapons and an experienced forward observer. Captain Min immediately put these new soldiers to work at night, digging the tunnels under Vintulai, as he was days behind schedule. On the 4th day of construction, Tran was put in charge of a squad to watch over the villagers as they continued their daily activities as if nothing untoward was happening in their innocent, peaceful village. His friend Bien was in charge of the other squad. It was still early in the morning when the two VC squads reached the village. Tran told Bien to take charge of both squads for a little while, as he was going back down the road to scour the area where the bodies of the burnt villagers had been dumped. He found it odd that the pile of dead bodies did not attract the attention of the enemy, which in turn would have sent patrols to investigate, which would then have led to another slaughter of enemy soldiers via a VC ambush. At first Bien started to protest, warning Tran that he would be in trouble if he were to get caught. But Tran was already on his way, pushing through the underbrush and disappearing into the jungle. Minutes later, the air began to beat, and the sound of thumping echoed across the sky as 12 American UH-1 Hueys appeared over the horizon. Tran returned from his personal scouting mission to Vintu Lai, waving his AK-47 and yelling at a group of villagers who seemed to have been waiting for his return. "Where are the bodies? Where did you superstitious people take the bodies?" The village leader, an elderly man with a thin white beard, looked at the unhinged VC soldier in bewilderment. "We do not know what you are talking about. What bodies are you—" "Liar!" yelled Tran, slapping the elderly man and knocking him to the ground. "You know what bodies I'm talking about. You buried them, didn't you? You buried the bodies." Immediately, a look of terror appeared on the elderly man's face as he finally comprehended which bodies the VC soldier was talking about. The other villagers standing around him moaned loudly and began to recite prayers. No, we didn't. You wouldn't allow us to bury the bodies. You should have. Oh, gods, you should have." It was then that Tran realized that he was alone. All of his comrades were missing. "Where is Bien?" he demanded, pointing his rifle threateningly. "Where are the others?" "That's what we came to tell you," said the old man, getting up off the ground, his hands held out before him. "Your friends received a radio transmission from your commander to return to your base. The Americans are coming." "Shit," yelled Tran, remembering the large fleet of American helicopters he'd seen flying overhead earlier. Tran turned and raced down the path which would lead back to the 773rd fighting positions. He was halfway to where his unit was located when he heard the first shot from a VC sniper rifle in the distance, followed by the sound of VC machine gun and AK-47 weapons fire. Tran's unit had ambushed the Americans, and he was missing all of the killing. Cursing himself, Tran picked up the pace, jumping over fallen trees and ignoring the cuts and scrapes from thorny vines in his eagerness to partake in the slaughter of the Americans. Finally arriving at the edge of a wide plain of tall reeds and grass, Tran got into a prone fighting position behind a berm, trying to make out where the enemy was and where his friends were. As it turned out, he found himself closer to the Americans than he was to his own lines. The Americans were trapped out in the open, and Tran could hear several of them yelling out in pain and calling for a medic. Tran saw a big American soldier crouching next to an American M60 machine gun and apparently yelling angrily at someone behind him. Astonishingly, the big American pointed behind himself, ordering his machine gun team to point their gun back away from where the VC were firing. Before Tran could comprehend such an illogical and absurd action, especially in the middle of an ambush, he heard the voice of an obviously panic-stricken American about 30 meters to his left, unseen behind the tall grass. Above the sounds of rifle fire, men yelling and RPGs exploding, Tran could barely hear the American yelling into his radio. Fire mission! Fire mission! Troops in contact. Grid coordinates. Tran could now make out what the big American was saying. He was threatening to shoot and kill the American with the radio unless he did his job. Tran realized with the start that the American with the radio hidden somewhere behind the tall grass was a forward observer. Knowing the danger that he posed, Tran began to low crawl towards the enemy, intent on stopping him from calling American artillery on his unit. As one of his unit's 81mm mortar rounds landed directly on top of the American forward observer's position. Smiling, Tran turned his attention on the big American who was directing the fire of the enemy machine gun. Obviously he was a leader of some sort, and Tran leveled his AK-47 on him. Before he could answer, however, from his firing position, Tran could hear the American forward observer's voice in the distance, exactly where the VC mortars had struck. Cobra Dan, this is Viper Strike. Fire mission. Impossible, thought Tran. How could that American still be alive? He low-crawled forwards through the brush, pulling himself ever closer to the American positions as the firing between the two sides intensified and VC mortar rounds began walking towards the trapped Americans. Soon, Tran was able to sneak around behind a giant termite mound and slowly pointed his AK-47 through the tall grass towards the dangerous American forward observer and the radio which allowed him to communicate with their artillery. Tran sighted through his rifle, then stopped, a perplexed look appearing on his face. The American forward observer has been pulverized by our mortars, he thought. He is dead and his radio is smashed. So who did I hear transmitting those firing coordinates to the Americans? All of a sudden, the fighting positions of the heroic 773rd VC Infantry Company erupted as American 105mm high explosive rounds crashed into them. The first round demolished the VC mortar tubes. The second, third, and fourth rounds obliterated all three of the VC heavy machine guns, and the fifth round vaporized Captain Puan Min and the company command element. Tran watched helplessly as every single American 105mm artillery round impacted with devastating accuracy on his comrades, completely wiping out the glorious 773rd VC Infantry Company. And it was in that moment, as he saw his unit being systematically torn asunder, that Tran felt something he had not felt since that one fatal night months ago when a sweet-talking girl with lovely green eyes convinced him to join the glorious revolution. Remorse, regret, and the overwhelming need for self-preservation. Completely forgetting his AK-47, Tran stood up and ran, turning his back on the battlefield and the sounds of American soldiers cheering the deaths of his comrades. Tran fled back into the jungle. Picking up the trail which led back to Vintulai village, Tran followed it for several minutes, constantly looking over his shoulders for signs that the Americans were pursuing him. Exhausted, he stopped, hands resting on a nearby tree. He bent over and was gasping for air. His heart sank with the realization that he could not return to Vintulai village, not after the way he treated the villagers. And without his AK-47, he couldn't force them to give him sanctuary. He briefly considered that he may not have been a revolutionary after all, but rather just a simple thug and a bully, a rapist who took what he wanted at the point of a gun while justifying his actions by wrapping himself in the banner of anti-fascism. He heard helicopters circling overhead and knew that they were all coming for him. He felt as if the world were coming to get him. Tran knew that the tunnels were his only refuge, but the tunnels back at Laokai village had been completely compromised, and the tunnels near Vintulai, in which his company had been hiding, were soon to be discovered. His only hope was to flee to the new tunnels under the Vintulai graveyards. There he would lay low until evening, where he could melt away and get far from here. He'd make his way back up north and return to the city of Quangtri. He was done with this war. He turned left and ran from the path leading to Vintulai, giving the village a wide berth as he circled around to where he knew the entrance to the new tunnels was located. Stopping to ensure that the coast was clear, Tran emerged from the jungle and raced down the heavily camouflaged narrow trail which led to the entrance. Not stopping to question why the bamboo mattress which hid the entrance had been pulled away, Tran dived into it, almost cheering in relief as the darkness swallowed him from prying eyes. He half ran, half crawled down the shallow main entrance, then took the first right-hand turn that he came to, which then took a sharp left as the corridor descended deeper into the earth. Coming upon a 4-foot hole in the corridor, Tran jumped down it, the air smelling musty and mouldy, as the deeper tunnel ran underneath the final resting place of the area's deceased inhabitants. There were a handful of torches which were hung on the walls, and Tran grabbed one from its sconce, lighting it with a match. The tunnels were incomplete, and the flame cast an eerie orange glow in the confined space. The walls here were tighter than they usually were. Tran felt the need to get even lower, and remembered that work had started on an even lower level of tunnel. If only he could find the hole which led down to it. He didn't have to look very far, as the tunnel he was in turned sharply to the right, the narrow passage leading to a dead end where a hole had been dug in the tunnel floor. Knowing that he had, at last, found the hiding place he'd been looking for, Tron crawled down the passageway and jumped down into the black void. Tron held up his torch to reveal that the hole had led him into a half-dug-out tunnel. In effect, he was in a pit. And they were waiting for him there, as if they knew Tron would be coming. And burned and charred skeletal hands clawed for him. The American soldiers searching the area for any escaped VC never heard Tron screaming so far, far below them. So that is, episode 4, is it? Yeah, I think so, yeah. It's the 4th one of these I've done in the Vietnam series. And I don't know about you, but I'm really, really enjoying them. All things a bit off, a bit creepy about wars. Yep, definitely in there. Loving it. If you like more, then there's more to come, definitely. So, let me know in the comment section below the video. Thoughts, feelings, anything you want. And I'll do my best to join in the conversation, as I always do. So, tomorrow night there is another episode of the podcast, episode 12 already, can you believe it? Feels like I only started a couple of weeks ago, but episode 12 already, and starting to feature some new stuff on the podcast that you can't hear anywhere else. A selection of old classics, but mixed in with some new and exclusive material as well, so please, if you're not listening to it, it's available pretty much anywhere where you get your podcast. Okay, that's enough for me for one evening, but I'll be back again in the podcast tomorrow evening, and here on Friday. Not quite sure what yet. Anything you really want me to do, let me know, and maybe I'll do it. Alright? Can't say better than that, eh? Well, until next time, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye.